All right, welcome everybody. It is the third Wednesday of every month. That means it's time for the Kubernetes Office Hours, the YouTube live stream where we hop on the internet with a panel of esteemed Kubernetes experts and hang out in Slack and answer as many of your user questions as possible. So welcome everybody. This is the West Coast slot. This is our second session of the day. So welcome everybody. I'm going to go through a little intro, kind of explain how everything works, and then it'll be fine. But before we begin, let's start by introducing ourselves, and let's go with BB, Monica, Dave, Samudrala, Jeremy, Tunda, and Eric. Since you're new, we will introduce you last to get us started. Welcome, everyone.
Hey, my name is Bhargav Bikaji. I am an independent consultant Kubernetes. I focus mainly on networking side of the story.
I'm Monica Rodriguez. I'm a site reliability engineer at VMware on the Tanzu Mission Control project.
I'm Dave Strabel. I'm a cloud native architect at Microsoft. I focus a lot around day two operations, CI/CD type stuff.
Hey, this is Vamshi Samudrala. I work at American Airlines as a cloud lead, clearly leading private and public clouds with Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry on private and Azure as a public.
Was I next?
Yes.
All right, cool. Sorry. I'm Jeremy Rickard. I work at VMware as well. I'm a software engineer, and I work on a team that's focused on doing internal Kubernetes offerings for a bunch of our SaaS services like VMware Cloud on AWS.
My name is Eric Osterman. I'm the founder of Cloud Posse. We are a DevOps accelerator. We help companies own their infrastructure in record time by building it for them and showing them the ropes. If you Google around for Terraform, you've probably come across some of our modules. We maintain over 130 or so Terraform modules, do a lot with EKS, do a lot with Kubernetes in general, Helm file, etc.
Dope.
Hi, I'm Tunde. I work on the customer reliability engineering team at VMware, primarily working with Kubernetes and other cloud native tools. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
And I'm Jorge Castro. I work at VMware as a community manager, and part of my job is putting together programs like this so that we can organize a community around stuff that is useful, things like sharing knowledge and stuff. The original reason I started this show was I had to learn Kubernetes, and I figured we could just stream it and have a good time. So we've been doing this for 2 years. We appreciate everyone joining us from YouTube. The way it works is if you see below, you'll see the Slack channel. It's #office-hours. We're also streaming that channel here on the sidebar on YouTube if you're watching it. So those of you in chat, feel free to say hello and where you're from, what you work on. So before we get started, let's talk about the ground rules. So first of all, this is a Kubernetes event. So the code of conduct is in effect in chat and in Zoom. So please be excellent to each other. This is also a judgment-free zone, which means everyone had to start from somewhere. There are no dumb questions. So all skill levels and expertise levels are definitely welcome. And while we will do our best to answer your questions, we don't have access to your cluster. So anything that's usually live debugging or stuff is off topic. Usually what I like to think is if you need to put something in a paste bin, it's probably a little bit too verbose. So what we will do instead is kind of look at what you got and then give you recommendations on where to move forward to debug the issue that you're having. Panelists, you're encouraged to expand on the answers with your production experiences and pro tips. Part of the reason that we have you on here is so you can share the little gotchas, the little nitpicks of stuff that you've figured out from like your years of expertise. Audience, you can help us out by pasting URLs to the official docs, blogs. We have a lot of people this morning helping answer questions for people maybe going into deeper threads and things like that. People love to recommend tools on this show. We love it. I think I've learned about a new tool every single session the entire time we've been doing this. So this is kind of a chance for us to kind of get together and share your knowledge. So if you're in chat, we definitely encourage you to do that and love it. And what I do at the end is we grab all the URLs from the show and we paste that in the show notes so that even if you're listening to this on YouTube later on, you can still have a reference of the cool stuff that we are referencing. So feel free to post your questions there in chat. We currently have 0 questions in the queue because we cleared it this morning. So we are open for questions there. If we don't get questions, I'm just going to start asking questions to the panel. So you probably don't want that. So feel free to start queuing up your questions. Semeldrala, if you would toss the YouTube link in the Kubernetes users channel to remind people that we're here. There's usually tens of thousands of people in there looking for help, and just have them check it out, maybe slide on over, and that would work. So you can always help us out by tweeting, spreading the word, paying it forward. And what you do is if we address your question, we'll automatically enter you in a little contest that we run. And at the end of the session, I give away 2 Kubernetes t-shirts, thanks to the CNCF. So with that, before we start, I'd like to thank VMware, American Airlines, Cloud Posse, Microsoft, and BB, who's an independent contractor, for allowing their engineers to take some time to help the community. It's always appreciated. And with that, we are now opening the floor to questions. It looks like some people are typing, so we'll go ahead and wait for our questions here. I see there's plenty of people in YouTube watching. So start typing. I want to go over some of the questions that we went over this morning. Let's see. We had a bunch of questions around. 1 second. Kubeadmin certificates that I wanted to re-ask for this group here. So someone asked this morning, I thought it was an interesting question, is why can't the Kubeadmin certificate be valid for 10 or 100 years? It's too painful. When we deliver Kubernetes to customers' production environment, we need to manually compile the Kubeadmin source or manually create a large number of certificates. Can't you give us an optional parameter or variable to flexibly configure this option? Now, I did point the person to the Kubeadmin office hours, which are happening right now, actually. But I wanted to get the panel's opinion on certificates and Kubeadmin, because in the back of my head, I was thinking, I think they default to a year to kind of remind you when your certificates expire that you should probably upgrade your cluster as time. So I figured I would ask a new panel opinions on this while the field kind of gets ready to ask some questions. Anybody?
First-hand account, literally this weekend, I was tasked with repairing a cluster whose certificates expired by that 1-year shelf. The embarrassing thing is the reason why they expired. So this happens to be a COPS cluster. So in COPS, they automatically regenerate those certificates on every upgrade. So really, this is just saying that we haven't upgraded the cluster recently enough, and that's the actual problem. That's the root cause. It's not that the certificates are too short. So I think having that be scheduled maybe in Jira or somewhere else that you do regular upgrades, treating clusters more as cattle and less as pets.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have opinion on Kubeadmin certificates?
Yeah, I mean, a year is a long time, and to me, aside from the actual upgrade, I mean, thinking of all the things that happen in a year to your cluster and how many people might come and go or have your kube config or something like that. I mean, a year is a long time. You certainly don't want to leave it forever or 5 years, and especially when already at that year mark, this is a task that you maybe have forgotten how to do. So I always like the practice of if it's a hard task, if it's something that's painful to do, you should do it more often to make it less painful. So that's one of those things that's super important. If you were to wait every 5 years to do it, you're going to have different people managing it. It's going to be a different process. So I think the more you do it, the better. And honestly, it should just be a seamless process, right? Rotate those certs, upgrade your cluster, do the things that need to happen, and continue on. It shouldn't be a painful thing. If it's painful, you're not doing it enough.
But at least at 5 years, it's OPP, right? Other people's problems.
I feel like that's a great quote. We should write down great quotes. If something is, what you say, if something is too difficult, you're not doing it enough?
Yeah, if it's something that's painful to do, you should do it more often, you're not doing it enough.
Yeah.
So I do remember having to rotate certificates before kubeadm, and that was horrible. So I'm at least happy to have that management capability there. So trying to do upgrades, for example, I don't know, like can't remember what version, maybe 1.9 to 1.10 or 1.11, something like that, that Kubernetes was still kind of beta, and just rolling through upgrades on our own was horrible. I mean,
Yeah.
it was such a painful process, and you could do some ugly shell scripting or some other kind of process if you wanted to do, but it was just painful back then. And I'm happy to have the tools we do now, for sure.
Yeah, that Kubeadmin's probably my favorite tool, because like I would have never been able to install a cluster without it. I did the hard way. The Kelsey Hightower, I think you want to do that thing once, right? To like get it out of the way and be like, I did it, and I could say I did it. I hope I never have to do that again. But I just remember the first time I did a Kubeadmin upgrade to a cluster, and it actually worked. I mean, yeah, it's a home lab, right? It's not like I have this huge thing, but it's just really nice when the tooling is in place. And our first question today comes from Bray. I hope I pronounced that right. It says, do you have any suggestions on how to set up Prometheus for cluster monitoring and to keep it highly available? I.e., would you put it in the same cluster, a separate cluster, or an external VM? Great question. Who wants to take a stab at this one first? Take it away, Monica.
I wasn't sure. I saw some unmute. So this is a common question, right? How do you monitor your monitoring ultimately, right? So this is something that in my experience, sometimes we've had the Prometheus in the cluster, and that's monitoring like the applications, but maybe it'll report some of the Kubernetes metrics and information as well. But if Kubernetes goes down, so is your monitoring. So you really do have to keep in mind where you're going to put it. So I've had situations where we're using like a consolidated Prometheus. So we'll like send metrics to another Prometheus that's kind of our master, and that's either in a different cluster with maybe a higher reliability goal as far as the availability of it goes, I guess. Or we'll use other services like maybe a Lambda service to watch the Prometheus, or maybe you just have it somewhere that's outside of Kubernetes, and it's like the age-old question, it feels like. But yeah, that's kind of the biggest thing, is you can't just rely on it to monitor your own cluster if it's going to live in the cluster. So it's great for all your apps and everything in there, but you need to do something else. Either pull another Prometheus instance out, or send it to another service like AWS Lambda, like Wavefront or something else, so you know when your Prometheus is actually down.
Yeah, and adding to that, right? Yes, that's a good point, Monica. Because when we are running Prometheus inside the cluster, we may run into chicken and egg problem. So when your cluster is having an issue, your Prometheus is down. You don't know what's happening inside it, what's caused that. So it's always better and best practice to have your monitoring outside your cluster and sending your metrics outside, running in any VM or any enterprise cluster or any shared one, so that it's better. You don't run into problems, or you rely on more highly available monitoring system rather than running it inside the cluster.
This is, yeah, I echo what everyone else has said. The other thing, this comes up all the time in our own office hours that we run. The problem also with running Prometheus in cluster is a memory hog. So if this is your production cluster, it's not uncommon that you're going to need to have a pod for Prometheus operator that's at like 15, 16 gigs of memory or more than that. So the consolidated approach allows you to run smaller Prometheus instances per cluster, and then you can have a more massive cluster, Prometheus cluster. Now, this is still the chicken and the egg problem that other people brought up. Then what monitors your monitoring cluster itself? So your phase shifting outages. So hopefully that your monitoring cluster is out of phase from outages happening in your production cluster. The other thing is your storage backend. And there's a bunch of open source projects for managing that storage backend. They're pretty hairy to get up and running. They have all come with trade-offs. Our experience has been EFS, man. It works really well so long as you ensure that you only have a single pod accessing the same file system at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And they have a follow-up question. War Daddy, we'll get to your question here in a minute. But yeah, let's continue. I heard someone start to talk. Sorry.
Oh, this is Dave. I was just going to say, yeah, you may want to also just take a look at like Thanos project or Cortex. That kind of talks about the other points that others made, and you can kind of be able to aggregate multiple Prometheus instances, and you can also use multiple different backend storages for those metrics.
Yeah, and Bray's actually follow-up question was, do you have any resource on setting up a master Prometheus? I'm not sure to send one Prometheus to another. And Monica, you toss a link in there to Prometheus Federation.
Yep.
And I just found the link there to Thanos. Do any of y'all have experience with the Federation and or Thanos?
I haven't worked with Thanos specifically, but it's something I've had explored a little bit. So I mean, it's another way to go about it. It just kind of depends on your use case, how big your environment is, what you're looking to send. Yeah, and as always with metrics, you want to make sure that you're sending the right information, because we could send way too much and we overload our system and you're not getting anything value out of there too. So it's always the metric tuning as well. So make sure you're picking your important indicators, your golden signals, whatever that might be in your specific system, and go from there as well. So it just it depends on your use case, I think.
And I just want to expand a little bit, since we're talking about Prometheus, we might as well just keep on going here. How do y'all typically set up and configure Prometheus? Is there a specific operator that you use, or like if I wanted to set this up, where would I start?
I think the Prometheus docs are great. Sorry, I'll speak up again. So I've set up my own Prometheus like in my own kind cluster, and honestly, just following right through is super easy, and it's just its own like Prometheus CRD. Like it's just the custom resources in there. So it's really easy. Prometheus docs are excellent. Yeah, I think anybody can follow along with it, and certainly there's tons of support to ask people for questions and help.
Is that your way of saying just follow the default docs?
It turns out for this thing, there are docs. So
yeah.
When there's docs available, start there and then ask questions.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I would also say the Helm chart for the Prometheus operator. There's a lot of configuration you can do in there. There's a lot of different stuff. Like you can even set it up with Thanos, but it comes out of the box with a lot of stuff. You might not need all that, but it's a really easy way to get started, and provides a bunch of dashboards out of the box and stuff like that. So it's a nice way to kind of get started at least.
And it looks like we have a few links. Marco Cheppy's back. Hey, Marco. So's Josh. We'll be getting to the Kafka question here in a minute. But Marco says we've been using Trickster, not exactly HA, but allowed us to set up tons of smaller constituent Prometheus as stateful sets and aggregate those into a larger single endpoint. Great tip. And Eric, looks like you posted a link to a blog post. You're muted.
Yeah. So this was just it's come up before. Thanos is a backend. There's another one, Victoria Metrics. Somebody brought up another one I wasn't familiar with. There's so many now. My problem with a lot of these is that there's so much infrastructure just to manage the backend. And ideally, I'd like my monitoring infrastructure to be as thin as possible and not as tall as possible. But companies with massive requirements aren't going to be able to get away with just maybe using EFS.
Yeah, so you're like, you know what, cloud provider? Your problem.
Yeah, that's what I want. I want Prometheus as a service.
So before we do move on to Kafka, though, I do want to ask a semi-related question. We're specifically talking about cluster metrics, not application metrics. So do any of you have opinions as far as, are those related? Would you run that? Would you run the app thing in cluster, or do you keep it like separation concerns? Walk me through real quick how you segment between the applications and the actual cluster itself. Or is it an issue at all?
Anything can be an issue.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Right. I mean, don't run your own monitoring and like load testing next to the app itself, right? Like, don't do that. So that's where you talk about like a monitoring cluster or some other place you're going to put that. But yeah, it's fine, I would think, to monitor your cluster from within the cluster, as long as you have that backup, that outside, if it's going to be Thanos, if it's going to be a federated Prometheus, so you have that higher level. I used Thruk way back when. It's not as an aggregator, but it's not supported anymore, not growing. But yeah, and then the application metrics can just be sent over to that Prometheus wherever you have it. But definitely don't run your monitoring in the same app, because all it takes is for that app to explode, and the monitoring then just gets bottlenecked with it, right? Receiving so many different metrics and pieces of information, and it just blows up entirely, so you can't even troubleshoot.
Yeah, distributed syslog spam. And War Daddy here is recommending Prometheus for cluster monitoring and uses Instana for app monitoring. Not heard of that one. If you could toss in a URL to that, that'd be really useful here. Cool. All right. Do we have anything else regarding Prometheus and cluster monitoring before we move on to Kafka? And I'm assuming most of you are just using Prometheus for anything. There's no alternatives that you could recommend. I'm sure there's alternatives, but any other comments on other tools?
I mean, if you're looking for open source tools, I think Prometheus is the leading one. But if
Yep.
it is an enterprise tool, like Dynatrace, Dynatrace is doing it, and we have other tools like Dynatrace. Yeah, Dynatrace is also offering it. Sysdig also we use.
Yep.
There's
Yeah,
also
I would just say on that, usually what I recommend, look what you have in your portfolio, because especially if you're in a large enterprise, you probably already have 10 monitoring tools. So if you have something that works for you, don't just chase the next best thing.
Right.
Really look at what you have, and if it solves your use case, then go with that. But I do find at the same time, somebody always ends up with Prometheus if they're using Kubernetes somehow or another. But really kind of look at what you have in your portfolio from those type of tools.
So, and I think that what hung me up is like, we definitely use Prometheus with Alert Manager, monitor infrastructure and applications. But then once you're getting into the applications, your APM, your application performance monitoring, then there's another suite of tools, both of the SaaS solutions mentioned, but then also like if you're doing Istio, you got, and you got to correct, somebody has to correct me on this. I've never known how you say it, Kiali or Kylie and Jaeger.
I know Jaeger. I haven't heard of the other one.
Yeah. I believe Kiali or Kylie, it helps you visualize the traffic flows.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, toss a link for that when you get a chance in Slack, because that would be interesting. Awesome. All right, last call. Any other Prometheus while we're at it? Bray, I hope that answers your question. Feel free to ask a follow-up, and we will get back to it. So War Daddy has an interesting question here. Was asking about how to use Kafka more efficiently in Kubernetes. Josh asked for a little bit more detail. So they say was using sync communication with Kafka from a microservice, but then it hits the FD limit. Microservice goes into restart mode. We used async communication later, but what are other ways to use it more efficiently? This still seems a little bit too much of a generic question. What do y'all think?
No firsthand experience.
Anyone using Kafka
no firsthand experience, but I mean, first I'm just going to name drop technology.
Sure.
Kafka operator. That looks interesting to me. I'm sure it's still alpha or beta, like everything else is. But
yeah, I'm just wondering if like the FD limit would be the file descriptor limit, right? I'm just wondering if that's like a node thing that you adjust that on the node, right?
I believe it's both. So yeah, it could be per container as well, the limits set. Yeah,
War Daddy, if you could just give us a little bit more information of exactly what the problem is, we might be able to help. So we'll go ahead and let them type there and collect their thoughts. Moving on to Jim Angel, co-chair of SigDocs. Welcome. Says, what are folks doing for inventory/tracking if running many clusters with many nodes? Any slick inventory operators or ways to track clusters? I'm interested in the panel's opinions here, because I'm sure there's probably lots of tools in the space. Wow.
I don't know of a tool to track the inventory. We have like home rolled things to keep track of stuff we have in AWS, like what nodes are associated with what cluster groups, because we run multiple clusters across different regions. So we
Sure.
have a pretty decent inventory of what clusters we have deployed, and then from
Mhm.
there we match to instances that are deployed in AWS. But we don't really, it's it's custom built for us. I would be super interested to know if there was a better tool as well.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on that. If in a cluster API world, the control cluster would kind of know, right?
Mhm.
Well, but that would be limited per region, right? I'm just thinking aloud in my
Yeah,
head.
I think
I'm
so.
not sure. Yeah. It's like, well, if you know the control cluster knows what clusters it spawned, but then you also have to keep track of your control clusters.
So as far as I don't know of any inventory operator outside of like the managed products, right? Like if you're talking managed products like TMC, what I work on, you can connect all your clusters and you can see all the information about it, version, health, and you can make new ones and a bunch of other stuff, right? This is not meant to be a plug. I'm just saying I know about that. As far as like, it depends. What do you want to manage? Are you just trying to figure out that, oh, this one's on an old version? Like, I mean, those are things I think that you could set up a metric for and report on that. Like you put in Prometheus, you could, set up something, I guess to have a comparison of current, but that would be kind of annoying to get alert on it. But you could certainly send metrics and generate reports to get information like the version about your cluster, or the overall health or something like that, to see that if you did like federated Prometheus, again, we're back to Prometheus, then you would be able to see all of your, kind of cluster metrics from there as far as the health goes. We like Jeremy said, we do have our own tools to kind of flip between different clusters. As far as like as an operator, I do like to use KDX for just to switch between my different kube configs and get to work with that. But my question would also be, I guess, why do you care? Why does it matter what nodes are in there? Like if it's, what do you need to know about it, right? It should be set up in a way that you don't have to go onto the nodes. If a node fails, like, are you handling that automatically or something? So I guess I would just kind of want to know what things you're worried about to monitor specifically, because there's some things, set it up and let it go and it should be good. Like you want to make sure you have your automation handling things for you.
Yeah, I would think well, just off the top of my head, I would think cost, right? Because I was about to tell Jim, look in your bill, but by then it's too late.
So we look for the cost reason, but we also we're running clusters in like fairly regulated environments like GovCloud with like FedRAMP stuff associated with it and PCI rules applied. So we have like all kinds of crazy scanning that's looking at the infrastructure itself, and we get all these alerts and like, oh, well, these nodes are no longer there, so we don't have to worry about going to triage this because it's been taken care of. But we do have to report back. So like for us knowing like what EC2 instances are actually running for which cluster, like, oh, this isn't a PCI cluster, we don't have to go deal with that right now. It makes it a lot easier for us.
And also depending on what platform the user is running on. So for instance, you were running on AWS, there are tags, and you could, through those tags, you could probably figure out what's associated with that cluster.
Yeah,
Right.
one other thing I've seen some users use is KubeCost. It does quite a few things. It's a little beta-ish, I would say, but it'll track like cost of the cloud provider, give you kind of recommendations on things that are oversized, have a full inventory of your clusters in that.
And I went ahead and tossed that URL in there. I was also thinking maybe for regulatory reasons, it might be, that maybe that kind of tracking might be important. That's not a field I'm familiar with, but I'm just thinking of reasons why you would want to, keep track of this stuff.
I'm trying to think of, I guess, reasons you would confuse your instances. I guess I don't.
Yeah.
Like it's if you're going through things and paying attention to regions and privileges and role escalation, things like that, it should be, I would think, pretty clear what belongs to what, I guess. But I guess it just depends how things are set up.
Yep. And then Sujay Pillai, sorry if I mispronounced that, linked up this infra.app, which is like a little cool desktop app that's showing you a bunch of stuff. We looked at a similar tool like this earlier. So awesome to see all these cool little dashboards and things like that proliferating everywhere. Okay, hopefully that answers your question, Jim. Feel free to ask another question there. Saloni, I hope I pronounced that right, asks, hello, is there a way to get notified if a Kubernetes pod goes out of memory without using the kube state metrics? Basically, the killer has terminated something. Is there a way to get notified on this? I would think, oh, go ahead, Eric.
It's a roundabout way, and it might not be exactly what you're asking, but I found it very helpful for this in a way that developers already use some of their tools. Sentry, what's the word I'm looking for? Exception tracking tool, is typically used by application developers to catch their exceptions. Well, there's actually a Kubernetes event forwarder for Sentry. So you can forward all your event log from Kubernetes to Sentry, and then using filters there, assign those to groups and things like that. So that's just another way of doing it that we found effective. I'll share.
That's interesting. Yeah. I found the URL there for their GitHub and I tossed it in there. Any other recommendations in this space? All right, that will hopefully get you moving in the right direction and give you a tool to investigate there. So let's see. People are tossing in lots of URLs. That's always good to see. Zachary has some recommendations here on Kafka. The same rules apply for any stateful data would apply to Kafka. If it's it is a database after all. Isolate the deployment within its own node pool with at least 4 replicas and ensure the backend disk is relatively high if possible. Ensure that your topics have enough replicas to match the number of brokers. That seems like reasonable recommendations to me. Then he mentions be very sure your topics are initialized correctly with the correct number of replicas. 4 brokers does little for you if you have 1 replica of your topic. Just saying. Thanks for that tip, Zach. Aaron Eaton asks an interesting question. What resources are people using to help developers and junior SREs get up the steep learning curve of Kubernetes? Coming from a mix of backgrounds using ECS, Compose, Heroku, Terraform, Puppet, and bare metal, we have some passionate Kubernetes advocates and some who don't know where to begin. This really hits close to me because I hang out with a ton of Kubernetes experts and there are always new people coming in, and it seems some days that the learning curve is very much like Vim except worse. So I'm really interested in the tips that you all have. Like, let's say I'm a junior developer, I'm just getting started, I know how to make a container. Where do I start, kind of thing? So I'm interested in how you all tackle this.
I mean, the obvious answer for me is you buy the Kubernetes best practice book that I co-wrote. That's your best way. But no, it's a typical question people have when trying to get your teams up to speed with Kubernetes, because your teams are going to have different experiences. Kubernetes is very operational heavy. Some may have more of a developer background. But I think the only way you can get them up to speed is getting their hands on. There's a lot of good, I think George might have mentioned it earlier, like Kubernetes the hard way. Even if you're using like a managed Kubernetes or some other commercialized Kubernetes, I think it's a great thing to go through because you really start to understand how Kubernetes kind of operates and all the pieces that go into it. Other than that, like your developers, you probably want to have a different focus for them compared to, say, your SREs. Developers probably shouldn't have to have, that level 400 knowledge of Kubernetes, or at least they shouldn't. So a lot of times there's so much material out there around Kubernetes. There's, 100 ways to go about it. But really getting them to understand the process of what it is to deliver their application on top of Kubernetes is where I would focus from a developer side.
So more of a workflow versus the ins and outs of the.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anybody else?
So I put a couple links in the chat there, so I can really address, I guess, more the junior SRE, because I think about this a lot, because I do try to, get other people involved. I try to have my friends, even that are in other areas of tech, like, hey, come over and learn Kubernetes. So I think the best way, like I think Dave said is you got to get your hands on it. That doesn't mean you have to have some full size production cluster to go and work on. You can do Kubernetes the hard way, and it is hard and painful, and that's fine. And that's a lot of people learn and step by step, and you're really getting in there. I started that and I didn't get through it. So going through and doing things like Minikube or like set up your own cluster on your desktop. Like there's a couple, okay, hey, you have to get your environment ready and get that stuff set up, but then you get your own cluster, and it doesn't matter if you break it. You're not costing any money in AWS resources even, because it's all local. So you get to play with it. You can deploy Prometheus on top. You could go and put like a WordPress site on something all local to your own machine and learn about it, and then delete that pod that has the WordPress site, and whatever else it might be. There's also, I put a link for Katacoda on there, has a couple Kubernetes modules you can go through, so then you don't even have to set up your own environment. I'm trying to think, I don't know, does Linux Academy have Kubernetes things? I think it does. And I think it does have Kubernetes stuff. So there's definitely some online like e-learning things as well. But honestly, my favorite thing to tell people is go put up a kind cluster on your desktop and then try and deploy something. Like there's lots of different projects there. And then if you go through and look at like the CNCF, the different projects, you can kind of read like, well, what is this? What is that? Because there's so many incubating and graduated projects and stuff to learn about there. And honestly, the docs are great. Like you could go and with Valero, for example, is one of my favorite projects. It's a backup restore, like data disaster recovery tool. So you could have your own little kind cluster, set up Valero, and then you could go through an exercise where you just delete something and try and restore it. So I think just getting your hands on in some way is really good. So that's what I would recommend for the SREs at least, and developers too, right? Just to get a general idea of what's happening in a Kubernetes cluster. Yeah.
Yeah, and Sammy just pasted in about 20 URLs worth of learning
I was
resources.
just about to tell that they're that all together now because of this COVID-19. They're like Udemy, Pluralsight. Site. These sites are all offering free courses, so you can get onto any other sites and then just get started learning. And Kubernetes.io docs is the primary one for me to just go, because they have interactive sessions also, which if you cannot find any cluster or anywhere to work on, they have an interactive guide, interactive setup where, I mean, definitely you can just work and type your commands and see what's happening there to just get started.
One other,
Go ahead.
One other thing that I think about while looking at that question, and I've seen people ask this question, is, from coming from an SRE background, you might be thinking about, how do I think about SRE terminologies like eliminating tall inside of a Kubernetes environment? And what I've seen to help a lot of folks is, first spinning up clusters with kind, but at the same time, once they spin up those Kubernetes clusters, going on top of the Kubernetes GitHub repository and looking at how most of the configurations are being codified inside of the repo, and then comparing those behaviors together. And then once you can do that, you can start to look into projects like Kube Operator or KubeBuilder, and seeing how you can interact with those APIs. So I think that's also something that could be considered doing for a learning process.
The other thing I was going to suggest too, if they're planning on using like a specific cloud provider, the cloud providers all have different workshops. Like in Azure, we have aksworkshop.io. AWS has eksworkshop.io. Those are really good if you plan on deploying Kubernetes to a specific cloud provider, because all these different cloud providers, they have their different intricacies around like running Kubernetes in those cloud providers. So a lot of times those are good if they're going to be on a specific cloud provider.
Okay, sorry, I have a kid at home, so sometimes it feels like interrupting. The one piece of advice I'd like to give everyone who's starting to learn, especially, is when I first started, I was so hell bent on figuring out how to install it. Like the first thing I did was like, how do I install this thing and just get it started? Because that's how I learn. And as a result, I found myself toiling away at dumb little configuration issues and not grasping the big picture of what Kubernetes has done for you. So usually I just tell people, get on a cloud provider or something at a free tier, deploy something like a blog, and like kill a pod and then watch it like fail over, and do all that kind of cool Kubernetes things. And so that you realize what the concepts are. And then I should have gone back and like apt-get install, like all this other kind of stuff. Cause I found myself struggling just getting it to work, that I failed to grasp the basic concepts until later on. And that ended up hindering my ability to learn. So that's just a tip from me there. Anything else on learning? Thanks a lot, Sammy, for that list of URLs. We'll definitely get those in the show notes. So let's see. Next question comes from Christian Roy. Welcome. Says, I am currently setting up a bash script to set up our dev staging GKE cluster so we can shut them down at night and restart them on mornings at will. But I'm wondering if there's any solution that exists that would allow me to bundle up all the resources needed, the cluster, the DNS, the various public Helm charts, Mongo, Redis, etc., with custom config, and our own applications happens to also be custom Helm charts, rather than a custom bash script. I know AWS has something called CloudFormation that might have allowed me to do this, but we are using GKE. If many tools exist, which one would you recommend?
I'd say there's a lot of tooling out there around there. Terraform would be one that comes to mind. And from like configuration management, you can also look at some of the GitOps tooling around Flux and Argo CD. Those are also good ones, but every cloud provider typically has their own type of way to deploy its infrastructure as code and do that. Terraform's agnostic to that. I find, at least on Azure, a lot of our users are using Terraform. Just because it's agnostic, and I can bundle even things outside of Kubernetes. Like if I have DNS outside of Kubernetes, I can utilize things like that. They also have some like a Kubernetes provider, a Helm provider, things like that. I don't know if I would recommend using the provider, but there's different ways you can bootstrap and kind of contain all of your infrastructure, full deployment of your applications and everything within just a Git repo.
Any other recommendations here? I feel like overwhelmingly Terraform is one of the more popular tools in this space.
Yeah, obviously biased here. We provide a lot of Terraform modules for EKS and use it. My recommendation would be, if you're just getting started with it though, you want to get the immediate gratification and the outcomes. And if Terraform isn't already the language that you're using everywhere, maybe it's not the easiest, and then tools like what others have been suggesting, I'm not sure, EKS CTL, if that was brought up, makes it pretty easy to get up and running. And by far, my experience, the easiest cluster to bring up is DigitalOcean Kubernetes clusters. That's one click with auto scaling.
Any other recommendations here? All right, Christian, I hope that points you in the right direction. Waleed, welcome, asks, okay, I might as well just ask, there's not too many questions. Actually, wow, we only have 15 minutes. This is we're burning through this. Earlier today, I was troubleshooting an issue and noticed that in the cluster there are deployment using PVCs with a storage class, local storage, and others with local storage -local. However, there is SC object when I do get SC that presents the storage class. How did that happen? Also tried to check the node for annotations, labels related. There was one called local storage equals true, but nothing corresponding in the deployment. Any ideas on this one? Also, if I've skipped your question, please feel free to re-ask it there in the chat. Any advice for Waleed on this one? The question's at 12:35 if you're scrolling up in the channel here. Wow. All right. We got stumped. I don't know where we go from here.
I think I would
Yeah.
have to look at it to kind of see what is going on there. I think that's kind of a specific one.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know what? Let me go ahead and link this up, because we do a lot of, we can't answer it live. And then as soon as we stop, someone in chat is able to answer the question. So if everyone could check that one out to help Waleed out, that would help, because we've got more generic questions here coming up. DevOps Day Mir asks, we are running a machine learning model in Kubernetes. pods. If my pod has reached 100% pod resources automatically restarted, but need to make some delay. Oh boy, hold on. I'm having a hard time with the grammar on this one. My pod has reached 100% pod resources and automatically restarted, but need to make, it looks like they need to add a 10-minute delay to the restart. How can they do that? And BB, you've recommended resource limits here for the pods, which sounds like just make it so they don't have to restart, right?
Yeah, they would. Yeah, what I suggested was to have a resource limits, and so that they don't have to get into the problem itself.
Yep. Is there a generic way to have a delay for pod restart?
I'm not sure if it's going to have an influence on it. I haven't looked into this. I mean, there's the pod termination delay or pod shutdown timeout or something. I forget exactly what the wording is. But it's the grace period before it force kills it. And I don't know if you can set it all the way up to 10 minutes, but you can set it to something.
Yeah.
Is there something you could do with an init container here so that when the pod comes back up, like the init container could hold it before it's totally up? I'm not sure. I haven't done anything with that.
Yeah, we talked about this earlier today, solving a different problem within a init container to do stuff to the pod before it gets marked as ready.
I thought this was. I thought it didn't want to be forcefully terminated for a period of 10 minutes once it hits the limits. Or
I'm having a hard time reading the question. I don't think English is their first language, so I'm not sure. It says restart needed, but make some delay of 10 minutes to restart.
I mean, as soon as the pod is reaching 100% CPU, the pod is restarted, right? But he wants to hold it on there for about 10 minutes before restarting it.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I've reached the limit. Don't blow it away. I got to copy a bunch of stuff off.
Yeah, so you need to wait on it rather than, that's what he was asking for.
Yeah. Okay, so Chris Hine, hey Chris, welcome, says check out termination grace period seconds under container lifecycle hooks. This might be able to give you what you want, but I'm not sure. That is an interesting one. Grace period would be a good one, but thanks, Chris, for that one. I appreciate you joining the show. Let's see. We had a really good question from Bree again. It says, do you have any, this one hits really close to home. Do you have any suggestions on how to organize the YAML files for Kubernetes resources? Right now, our cluster was set up with a bunch of YAML files that were applied manually, which is very difficult to track. Would you use Helm charts heavily there? Or is this something like GitHub's workflow? Javier is recommending customize with a K with Flux. Monica, you had some comments here. If you could summarize those, that'd be great.
Yeah, I haven't worked with Helm charts. I found people either love them or hate them, right? It's kind of no middle ground there. So if it's something that you have, keep going with it. I don't think there's any one perfect answer. There's not. It's hard, right? If you just YAML sprawl is an issue. So I use Customize. It works. It's nice to kind of be able to configure the different environmental variables and then pass it in. So that's really handy. As far as like preventing people from deploying, I mean, that's a procedure. That's a process issue that you have to figure out, right? If you're going to, you have to establish your promotion process for the code. If you're going to incorporate into CI and have it deploy automatically based on whatever your process is, that's a much bigger thing than I think just the technical aspects, right? If you're looking at, you've got rogue developers or people that are just applying whatever YAML they want, you got to look at that privilege escalation, the access roles, things like that. So that's a very big question, but if you can get more automation in and people out, I think is always a good thing there. But definitely you have to look at like, what are your controls? Like, when should you deploy to production? Like, what's the impact when you do stuff? Can you just roll that? Can you do daily deployments, right? Everybody wants that instant, like, commit to master and it gets deployed. So it's a big question, I think.
Yeah. I'm getting a lot of the someone else set up this cluster and it's been in production for a while, and I'm trying to figure out what's happening here. Who deployed what? Feels like a pain point to me. Any other opinions here?
Yeah, I was just gonna mention on we talked about like Customize and Helm. If you're just kind of getting started, I really like Customize because it's a lot easier to reason with than all the templating and everything that goes into Helm and the intricacies of Helm. Helm does provide value, don't get me wrong, but a lot of times when you're just starting out with Kubernetes and that, it can add another layer of abstraction that you're going to have to start learning, where I think Kustomize you can pick up pretty easily there. So I typically recommend people start with Kustomize, unless they have a really solid use case for using Helm.
Yeah, I agree with Dave on that one. I think that Kustomize also is more geared towards when you're deploying your own in-house apps, perhaps. But Helm, on the other hand, is, I think, a big reason why Kubernetes has reached the traction it has, and ECS hasn't, because Kubernetes has a packaging system for Helm for getting quickly up and running with these crazy applications like Prometheus. Look at the chart for that. I would never want to be maintaining my own Kustomize for Prometheus. But once you start doing, it's always layers and layers and layers. So now you have all of these Helm charts that you're deploying. So you're moving that much faster, but at some point you reach critical mass with that. How do we manage the configuration now for that? And that's where other tools have come up. We use a tool called Helm File, which makes it very easy to declaratively describe how to deploy those apps to your Kubernetes cluster. The change control, I'd love to talk about change control, but I don't know if we've exceeded this time for this.
We're kind of running out of time, but that's great. I do want to read out what Zach Lober said here, and this just rings to me. He goes, first, it goes into Git repo, ensure it only gets delivered via a pipeline next, then pick it apart based on core services shared between workloads and the workloads themselves. But I think getting to the point where like you have the source of truth in Git and only the pipeline can do the thing is probably a good place to start versus a directory full of YAML files. And a lot of good tips there from people in that customized thread. We have time for one more, and then we're going to give away the t-shirts. And this one comes from Javier, who asks, what's the purpose of setting a CPU limit if the container might be allowed to exceed it and won't be killed, or is it just to override the limit range admission controller? How does Kubernetes know whether it will allow it or not? Does it depend on the allocatable resources of the node? And then there are some comments here that I'm going to go through while you all talk about this one. Let's see. So Jawiz says CPU limits are based on C groups. If you set a limit, you won't be able to use the limit. It's not supposed to kill it. If it's memory, it'll get oomed. If CPU, it will throttle. So we're not talking about memory. We're talking about CPU. And then Jawiz says, maybe the docs, wait, no. Javier says, maybe the docs are wrong then about the CPU. No, not really. The pod won't be killed because of CPU usage, but CPU usage will be throttled. It might be allowed to exceed the limit, but on average, it will be within the limit you set. So is this one of those things where it's like a CPU will bursty and then it'll just come back down? Versus I feel like memory is kind of like a hard cutoff, but that's just a guess. Audience, does that sound right? And then Javier says, or Walid says, yes, kill from memory only has and then Javier said the behavior should be the same as memory. How does Kubernetes know whether it will allow or not? Does it depend on the allocatable resources of the node?
So the limits are what's going to help it then get rescheduled onto other nodes. And basically, it's given a time slice of CPU time to operate in. And after that, the CPU goes on to the next process. It's happening millions of times a second. Yeah. But yeah, that time slice is how it's throttled.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it's one of those things where it's like, you know what? You had X amount of CPU time and you're exceeded, so you're going to get rescheduled, But, is it like a normal Linux machine where you could be running over for a while, and stuff is like really swappy and then it figures it out kind of thing?
Yeah, no, you can get noisy neighbors on one box, and it's especially a problem if you're not setting CPU limits on there. But if you have the CPU limits set, on average, like you said, it should be fine. And new pods that get scheduled won't be scheduled on that node.
Right.
What I've seen is you can, I forget exactly, what you can also have is something so that the pods don't live forever and they get rescheduled. And that's how, on average, they get redistributed across the cluster. Maybe they're more elegant solutions.
Yeah. Any other opinions on this one? No one's hanging out at a SIG-Node lately. If you're someone from SIG-Node, would be able to tell us specifically.
Totally.
All right, and with that, oh, go ahead, Dave.
Oh, I was just gonna say, you really, to kind of understand all that, is really looking at, because you have like a quality of service too, and it's going to be dependent on what you set for request and limits. So if you want to have guaranteed QoS, then you have to set those request and limits the same.
Mhm.
Where there's also going to be, best effort, and also other classes burstable. So all
Right.
those have kind of an impact on there. I find that's one thing. Uh, it seems like an easy concept, but when you start digging into like resource management in Kubernetes, it's something you really need to start understanding. I see
Mhm.
users run into this issue all the time, and it's like, oh, it's kind of got a different behavior than I thought.
Mhm.
I ran into a lot of this when I first started learning Kubernetes myself. So it's an important kind of subject to really start understanding all those things that go into how the scheduler is going to schedule workloads onto the nodes based on request allocations and that.
Yeah. And well, Leeds dropped a link to the Kubernetes 6 descheduler, which is interesting project. I think we mentioned this one last time, I think.
That was the one I was thinking of.
Yeah.
The one can install.
Perfect. And with that, we are out of time, but I am ready to give away 2 Kubernetes t-shirts. The winners today are Bree, B-R-E, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, and Javier. You both won Kubernetes t-shirts, so I will PM you after this, give you a little code. You go to store.cncf.io and get your cool Kubernetes t-shirt, which we always forget to wear so we can show you what it looks like. But big shout out to the CNCF for sponsoring the t-shirt giveaway. And with that, any final thoughts? Panel, Eric, this is your first time. Great job.
Oh, thank you. It was a lot of
Yes.
fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, awesome.
A lot of activity going on here.
Yeah, it's really fun. One of the things I wanted to tell before we close, I wanted to tell everybody is between BB, Pierre, and myself are trying to figure out so we're going to keep these generic office hours because they're useful, but maybe adding a more topical session once per month. So we're thinking we might do something like Ingress next month, where it's a dedicated session on Ingress, and then basically, having a generic open session like this, but also having a topical one every month as we take a tour throughout the Kubernetes components and kind of, build like, all right, if you're really stuck on Ingress, this is the one session you need to catch, and to give us kind of a video documentation for the rest of the year. So if you're interested in helping doing that, it's definitely hang out in the office hours channel. Feel free to hang out here. It's like a smaller subset of Kubernetes users. So consider it your safe place to ask questions. And with that, any last ones? Thanks everybody for joining us. We hope you had a good time, and we hope you come back. It's always the third Wednesday of every month, and keep an eye out. Thanks, panel. Panel, actually stick around for a second, and everybody else, we will see you next month. Thank you.